Skin of My Tooth. His memoirs by his confidential clerk, compiled and edited by Baroness Orczy. Number 5. The Case of Mrs. Norris. I've always known Skin of My Tooth to hold the axiom that justice is invariably on the side of the cleverest lawyer. I might as well at this point record the fact that he held the learned gentleman of the bar in complete and withering contempt. "They are a necessary evil to the high courts," he would say, but then, to my esteemed employer, everybody in the court of law, from the judge downwards, was a necessary evil. He would have liked some arrangement by which he could have argued out a criminal case with another lawyer, that side to win who got the best of the argument. I can recall one or two narrow shaves where the judge and a jury's decision really seemed a matter of tossing a halfpenny. It might go either way, and my chief fully deserved the nickname which the public had now universally bestowed upon him. But of the many interesting cases with which Skin of My Tooth was associated after the Duffield peerage case had brought his name so prominently before the public, none, I think, seemed at the first glance to intricate, and demonstrated his weird gifts more marvelously than the case of Mrs. Norris. She was a pale, delicate-looking woman, I should say not more than 25 years of age, and no doubt among her own friends would be called pretty. Of course, when Skin of My Tooth saw her in Holloway, she was evidently worn out with sleepless nights, and half crazy with the horror of the position in which she found herself. Her speech was very incoherent, with a curious mixture of self-accusations and vigorous protestations of innocence, together with the marked obscenity of her general attitude. Would have irritated any man less devoted to his calling than Skin of My Tooth. The facts, as far as they were known to the police and to the public, and as far as Mrs. Norris herself was willing to admit, were briefly these. On Thursday, April 17th, the inhabitants of Sherland Mansions, Malda Vale, were startled at 11 o'clock at night by loud screams proceeding from one of the flats. Very soon, the door of number 22 was thrown violently open, and Mrs. Norris, who occupied the flat with her husband, came out on the landing, loudly calling for help. To the neighbors, who immediately responded to her call, she seemed like one demented. Her eyes were starting out of her head. Her face was livid, and with trembling fingers she was pointing towards her own apartments, whilst, in answer to every query, her quivering mouth murmured repeatedly, "There, in the sitting room." At last, Mr. Daniel, from number 23, less nervous and excitable than the other neighbors, made up his mind to ascertain what it was that had so completely shattered Miss Norris's nerves. One glance into the sitting room, where the electric light was fully turned on, told him the whole gruesome tale. The body of Mr. Norris was lying on the floor, with his throat cut. There was no doubt that he was dead. The body was rigid, the face livid, whilst the eyes stared up at the ceiling with a look of infinite terror. In his hand the unfortunate man held, tightly clutched, the razor with which evidently he had put an end to his own life. Following Mr. Daniel's example, a few of the neighbors had crowded into the small flat. A young fellow from number 20, who owned a bicycle, suddenly bethought himself that perhaps a doctor or the police would be needful at this juncture, and so he went off, leaving a select few to gaze awestruck at the helpless and rigid body, and to offer well-meant but wholly ineffectual comfort to the half-crazed young widow. It was, of course, very late at night when at last the detective inspector from the station, accompanied by 2 constables and the police divisional surgeon, came in response to the call from the cyclist. After that, the crowd of eager and inquisitive neighbors had perforce to retire within the precincts of their respective flats. From the very first, the general public refused to believe in the suicide theory. The morning papers already on the following day threw out vague hints of possible sensational developments. The coroner's inquest, held on Monday, only confirmed that already everyone had suspected, namely that Mr. Norris had been murdered. The doctor declared that the wound in his throat had not been caused by the sharp razor found clutched in the dead man's hand. It had been inflicted by a much blunter instrument. Now, no knife of any kind was found on the scene of the tragedy, but a few drops of blood were noticed by the detective inspector on the earthenware sink in the kitchen, showing that the murderer had washed his hands and his instrument there. Probably after that, he found the razor in the dressing room and placed it in the victim's hand in order to raise the question of suicide. But it was the examination of Mrs. Norris which furnished the truly sensational element of the tragedy. She repeated before the coroner that she had already told the police, namely, that on the fateful night she had been out to dine with a friend in the neighborhood of Swiss Cottage. She came home at 11 o'clock at night, and going straight into the sitting room, turning on the electric light, she saw her husband lying on the floor, dead. Horrified beyond measure, she had screamed for help. She, too, had first believed in the theory that Mr. Norris had for some unaccountable reason committed suicide. Certainly, he had no enemy, to her knowledge, and she professed herself quite unable to throw any light upon the mysterious affair. It appears, however, that her attitude when originally questioned by the police was so strange, her confusion and excitement so manifest, that Mason, the detective who had the charge of the case, set to work immediately to verify her statements. He saw the friend with whom Mrs. Norris had dined that evening of her husband's death, but he had also ascertained that she left the friend's house at 9:30 o'clock. Pressed by the coroner, now she seemed absolutely unable to give any account as to how she spent her time between 9:30 and 11 p.m. She had walked about the streets, she said, but at the night of the 17th had been pouring wet. The statement was, to say the least, peculiar. Unfortunately for her, no one in the mansions had heard her come in. The outside doors not being closed until 11:30, anyone could come or go easily and unperceived. The owners of the other flats in the same building could not give the police much help in the matter. One statement in connection with the Norrises, however, was quite unanimous among all witnesses, namely, that the quarrels between husband and wife amounted to a positive scandal. According to Mr. Daniel, at number 23, scarcely a day passed when the Norris menage without a domestic squabble. It was generally supposed that the young wife's extravagance and love of dress, and the husband's ungovernable temper, were the causes of the disunion. On the very night of Mr. Norris's death, Mr. and Mrs. Wyatt, in the flat immediately below his, heard at 10:30 o'clock at night the sound of a scuffle overhead. So loud it was that Mrs. Wyatt suggested that her husband should go upstairs and intervene, as she was quite sure Mr. Norris was murdering his wife. I don't think that anyone could blame the police for the course they adopted in this very mysterious affair. They arrested Mrs. Norris on the charge of murdering her husband. Brought before the magistrate, she pleaded not guilty, and repeated her story with wonderful obstinacy. She had dined with a friend, and from 9:30 to 11 had walked about the streets alone. Her whole manner on the subject was confused in the extreme. There was something here that she wished to hide, was apparent to everybody. But the lie told against her, of course, and were it not for the fact that the magistrate was a peculiarly humane and kindly man, We took pity on her lonely position and remanded her so that she might obtain legal advice immediately. And there's no doubt that she would at once have been committed for trial. Part 2. It was at this point that Mrs. Norris's relations approached the skin of my tooth with a view that she should undertake her defense. The case had interested him from the first, and he was quite ready to give the unfortunate women the benefit of his great skill. He saw her in Holloway. She was obviously pleased to have his legal advice, and seemed inclined to be less reticent than she had been hitherto.
"I may have acted very thoughtlessly, Mr. Mulligan," she said, "but I had no one to advise me, and really, I've been half crazy with this horrible accusation hanging over me."
"I think you were very foolish to make such a secret of how you spent your time between 9:30 and 11 on that fateful night. An alibi in a case like yours is imperative. I hope that you have quite made up your mind to be absolutely frank with me."
"I'm afraid that when you hear how simple the explanation is, you'll think me worse than foolish."
"It doesn't matter what I think at this point," remarked Skin-in-My-Tooth dryly.
"After I left my friend at 9:30,
she began speaking, I thought, with a strange nervousness.
"I went to see another friend in Hamilton Terrace, with whom I stayed nearly 11 o'clock.
"As you say, it is extremely simple," said Skin-in-My-Tooth, who had noticed her curious and constrained manner, and was looking at her through his thick and fleshy eyelids. "The alibi is quite perfect, of course. Your friend will corroborate the statement." She hesitated very palpably, then she added,
"I took a hansom to go home. No doubt the cabinet can be found."
"No doubt. But it was a dark night, and the cabin may not be able to identify you accurately. Still, it is an additional evidence, your friend's being, of course, the most valuable. Will you give me her name and address that I may communicate with her immediately?" Again, Mrs. Norris hesitated visibly for a moment before she replied.
"Lady Ralph Morshampton, 196 Hamilton Terrace."
Her attitude was a puzzle to me, and I could see that Skin-in-My-Tooth was both mystified and vexed. However, he dropped that point for the moment and questioned Mrs. Norris of the probable motive for the murder. "The police tell me that the rooms had evidently been searched through and through, possibly for money or valuables. Do you know of anything that may have been tempted by murder?"
"Nothing," she replied almost emphatically. "We were in very modest circumstances. We never kept money in the house beyond a sovereign or so, and we had no valuables of any kind."
"And you could not account for the wild search which was evidently made through the rooms for something? You know, the dressing bag was turned inside out, and the drawers emptied. Even the books in the bookcase were disturbed."
"I don't understand it,"
she replied with a return of that strange nervous willfulness which was so unaccountable, and which had already so much prejudiced her case.
"I cannot account for any of it in any way."
With marked impatience, Skin-in-My-Tooth rose to go. I could see that he was within an ace of throwing up the case, for it was clear, of course, that Mrs. Norris was not absolutely frank, even with him. But the case had gripped him, and this additional puzzle only aroused his further interest in it. It seemed literally to bristle with mysteries. He controlled his rising temper for the moment, and took leave of his client, promising to call again early the next morning. "What does that woman lie to me?" he said savagely the moment we were outside. "She knows or guesses the motive of that murder, I'll swear. She is guilty herself, after all, or she's shielding a friend. And what in heaven's name has Lady Ralph Morshampton have to do with it?" I of course, could not answer these intricate questions, and returned to the Finsbury Square in silence. We found that during our absence from the office, a boy had introduced a visitor to Skinnamarooth's private room. Lady, sir, he explained. She wouldn't give a name, but she wouldn't wait here and had to show her in. I followed my chief into his private office, where the visitor was waiting. She was a lady, very elegantly dressed, who rose with languid grace to greet Skinnamarooth as he entered.
Mr. Mulligan,
she asked. That's my name, replied my chief as he drew an easy chair forward for her and seated himself at his desk, viewing his elegant visitor with more than professional interest. She seemed a little troubled at what to say next, and looked across at me, somewhat doubtfully. My confidential clerk, explained Skinnamarooth, as trustworthy as myself. Still, if you wish it, he can go.
Oh, no, not at all. Since he has your confidence, I have nothing more to say. I did not leave my name with your office boy, Mr. Mulligan, as I would wish, as far as possible, that my interview with you should remain confidential. I am Lady Ralph Morsinghampton. You no doubt know my husband by his name, and I came to see you about a matter connected with the murder of Mr. Norris in Sherlock Mansions.
Indeed, commented Skinnamarooth.
Yes,
she continued with more composure.
I know a good deal about this Mrs. Morris. She is accused of murdering her husband. As a matter of fact, I think I can explain to you the reason why that cruel and dastardly crime was committed.
Indeed, repeated my employer, quite amused.
As a matter of fact, Mrs. Norris was in my house only an hour or so before she committed that awful crime. She was producing a policy of blackmail against me, Mr. Mulligan, and finding that my poor husband would not be party to this ignoble policy, she made him its victim.
I don't quite understand.
I must try to make it quite clear. Before my marriage, Mr. Mulligan, I was on stage, and as it happened, just before I was engaged to Lord Ralph Hampshire, a villainous scandal was circulating amongst my envious colleagues, coupling my name with that of Adam Norris, the young dramatic author of much promise. Fortunately, that scandal never reached the ears either of the Marquis of Camberley, my father-in-law, or of the exalted society of which I am about to become a member. I am the daughter of a gentleman, and had always acted in Shakespearean dramas only. Society, after my marriage, tolerated me from the first, but now, after strenuous efforts on my part, it has finally accepted me. I have a position within its circles which may envy. And meanwhile, Adam Norris also married. There is some unaccountable carelessness on his part, which amounts practically to sin. His wife got to know of that old and buried scandal amidst himself and me. He had been a fool enough to keep my letters. I believe they were distinctly compromising. I really had not remembered them all, but Mrs. Norris, having caught sight of them once by accident, bethought herself of doing a bit of illicit traffic with them. She was inordinately fond of finery and gaiety, passions which her husband's somewhat modest position would not allow her to indulge in. She wrote to me one day, offering to sell me my old letters for a couple of £1,000, and a few introductions in good society. Now, Mr. Mulligan, I am the wife of a very rich man, with plenty of money at my command with which to gratify any passing whim. In this case, it was my whim to pay money down and regain possession of those letters sooner than allow my husband and my friends to know their contents. I wrote to Mrs. Norris asking her to come and see me Thursday evening, the 17th. She came about 10 o'clock, and we had a short interview. in which it was agreed between us that I should give her £4,000 and no introductions in exchange for the letters. I must tell you that she informed me that she had not got the letters. Her husband had them still, but she seemed to think that she would have no difficulty in obtaining possession of them. I could not tell you exactly at what hour she left me,"
concluded Lady Ralph Hampshire coldly.
"but I imagine that she went straight home, well, and that she had some difficulty in persuading her husband to give up those letters. What do you think yourself, Mr. Maligan?"
"I was merely wondering, Lady Morsampton, whether you are really convinced in your own mind that Mrs. Norris actually murdered her husband."
"I really have not given that subject a thought. I merely came to you today because I thought that probably she would have given you her own version of the interaction with me, and that you might take it into your head to cite me as a witness on her behalf. You will see for yourself, I am sure, that this would do your client no appreciable good. On the contrary, it would furnish the prosecution with a strong additional weapon against her, a motive."
"You forget, Lady Morshampton," retorted Skin of My Tooth, taken aback in spite of himself at this extraordinary display of callousness and egoism. "You forget that citing you as a witness would also give me an additional motive in my client's defense."
"I don't understand."
"The question of time."
"Oh, that is very vague," she retorted placidly. "I do not wish the servants to know of Mrs. Norris's visit, and that is why I had the hour 10 o'clock, when they were alone at supper. I was on the watch for her and opened the door to her myself. I let her out when our interview was over. I could not tell you at what time that was. I am quite sure that none of the servants even knew that she had been in the house."
"But your husband?"
"Lord Ralph was in the smoking room when Mrs. Norris called. I heard him go out a quarter of an hour or so later, and he certainly did not come in until after she left."
"Therefore, if I cite you as a witness—"
"You do so at Mrs. Norris's risk and peril,"
said Lady Ralph Hampshire, rising from her chair, and cooler than any cucumber.
"I tell you that I could not swear positively at what hour she left me, and I know that she took the hansom low down the road. I live in Hamilton Terrace, and it is only 5 minutes' drive at most, I think."
And she added firmly. Then she moved gracefully toward the door.
"That I have succeeded in convincing you that it would be more prudent to leave my name out of this case altogether, have I not? Perhaps, after all, Mrs. Norris was wise and did not mention her visit to me, in which case there is no harm done, as I know I can rely on your discretion. By the way, I have not got those letters yet. Will you tell Mrs. Norris that the bargain still holds good? Thank you so much. Good morning, Mr. Maligan. A very wet spring, is it not? I just hope we shall have fine weather for the coronation. Don't trouble to see me down. I shall get a hansom myself."
When she had gone, Skin of My Tooth turned to me with a heavy grunt. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Muggins," he said, "let's have some air. Open the windows. Even the slushy London air is preferable to the moral atmosphere this elegant lady has left behind her." Part 3. We saw Mrs. Norris in prison that same afternoon. The interview was somewhat stormy, as Skin of My Tooth was furious with her. Nothing enrages him so much as a want of absolute confidence on the part of his client, and I am quite sure that in this instance he would have thrown up the whole case and let Mrs. Norris literally go hang. But for the fact that the ever-increasing mysteries in connection with it had roused out his passion for what was interesting in the history of crime. There was no doubt that Lady Ralph Morshampton's narrative had added fresh mystery to this already bewildering case. Mrs. Norris, sternly questioned by Skin of My Tooth, corroborated it in every detail. The reason why she had so ostensibly held her tongue on the subject was because she felt convinced that her attempt at blackmailing and her avowed interest in obtaining possession of certain letters belonging to her husband would furnish the prosecution with an additional terrible weapon against her. Moreover, she felt instinctively, and there her instinct did not err, that Lady Ralph Morshampton would prove a bitter enemy whom it would be unwise to drag into the case more than absolutely necessary.
"Do not dare tell anyone, Mr. Mulligan," she pleaded pathetically. "Don't be hard upon me. I was quite convinced that something would turn up to prove that I did not commit that awful crime. I don't believe now that justice can err in such an extent."
"You certainly have done your level best to damage your own case," growled Skin of My Tooth, somewhat mollified. "But now tell me, at what time did you leave Lady Ralph Morshampton?"
"It was just before 11. I took a hansom and told the driver to put me down at the corner of Elgin Avenue. Shirley Mansions are just a few yards further on."
"But what about the letters?"
"I haven't got them, Mr. Mulligan. Just before the inquest and before I was accused, I looked for them in their accustomed place, but they had gone."
"Where was the accustomed place?"
"Between some books on the bookshelf. I don't think that my husband attached much importance to them. Anyway, I knew that I could easily get them at any time."
"The police did not find those letters, I know," said Skin of My Tooth to me later that day. "It is clear, therefore, that the murderer succeeded in getting hold of them, and the clearer still that the crime was committed in order to obtain possession of them. Now, if Mrs. Moore speaks the truth, she was with Lady Morshampton until close on 11, when she went straight home."
"Perhaps, after all," I suggested, "Mr. Norris committed suicide, and then his wife, on coming home, merely hunting for the letters and not finding them in their accustomed place, turned the room topsy-turvy before giving the alarm." To my astonishment, Skin of My Tooth did not receive my suggestion with the scorn which I feel it deserved, for he usually bestows upon my attempts in that direction. It was clearest of all to me that my esteemed employer was completely at sea for the moment.
"You shall find out for me, Muggins, whether Mrs. Norris did speak the truth or not. I give you 2 days to do it in. And mind you, don't mention the subject to me during the time. You know how to set to work, of course."
"I think I do, sir. In any case, I will have an advertisement ready for all the daily papers tomorrow, and the police notices all over the town, for the hansom cab driver who drove a lady to Hamilton Terrace in the corner of Elgin Avenue on Thursday, April 17th, at about 11 p.m.
"That's all right, Muggins. You're not quite such an ass as you look. Fire away, then, and whatever you do, don't speak to me for 2 days."
The next morning, my advertisements were in every paper and my notices all over the town. 24 hours after that, I knew the name, address, and number of the cabman who drove a lady at that hour on the day and to the destination I had mentioned. Unfortunately, he had not seen the lady's face and certainly would not know her again. In the meantime, life at the office was anything but pleasant. Skin of My Tooth was in those tempers of his during which it is not good to talk to him. And that he had got some fixed idea in his mind about that murder, I was then already quite sure. I knew the symptoms well. For all the world like a great frowny hound smelling blood, he sat for hours curled up in his armchair, smoking his long-stemmed German pipe, whilst even his beloved French novels were discarded. Every now and then I would see that weird and cruel spark flash in his lazy blue eyes. Then I knew that the tracker of blood was on the scent, and that he had held a clue, and that his mind had already solved the problem which would bring the murderer of Mr. Norris inevitably to justice. I told him the result of my investigations when the 2 days had elapsed. It was then 10 o'clock in the morning, and we had just both arrived at the office.
"Sit down, Muggins," he said. "I expect a visitor."
I could see that he was very excited. He went himself to the door, when presently a heavy step was heard in the passage. Skin of My Tooth's visitor was a big, burly fellow, wrapped from head to foot in a huge overcoat.
The word cabby seemed to be written all over his recumbent countenance. He had a copy of the Daily Mail in his hand, to which he was pointing somewhat anxiously as he walked into the room. "You're the gent, ain't you, sir?" he asked presently. "Who put this advertisement in the mail?" "Yes, I did put that advertisement in, and you got your letter this morning. So you see that I was expecting you." "Ah," replied the cabby with a grin of satisfaction. "Says here that you'd give a reward of a fiver. What do you want to know about the drove a gent to Hamilton Terrace to somewhere near Elgin House the evening of April 17th? "That's it exactly." "Now, I drove a swell from top of Carlton Hill to the corner of Elgin Avenue and Mounted Vale about 10:15 that night. It was pouring wet, and when I dropped him, he went into Lord Elgin for a drink. Now, about 3/4 of an hour, the same swell picked me up again just as I was turning into Melvin Rail, and I took him back to Hamilton Terrace." "You don't know the number?" "No, I don't. But I know the swell again if I see him. He gave me a 5 bob each way. I thought he looked as if he'd been drinking with the drove home. His clothes were all anyhow. He had on a silk comforter round his neck, which he left in the cab." "I suppose you won't mind throwing that comforter in with most of the valuable information that you've been so good to give me in your," suggested Skin My Tooth, "and for which I shall have much pleasure in handing you the promised £5 note." A broad grin illuminated the worthy old cabby's countenance. He drew from his pocket a large colored silk muffler, which he placed on the desk. Then he stretched out a very large and very grimy fist towards a crisp banknote which Skin of My Tooth was holding out towards him. "I'm mighty glad, sir, that my effort and memory is worth all that to you," he said sententiously. "Not to me, cabby," said Skin of My Tooth with a smile, "but to an unfortunate woman whom your excellent memory has saved from the gallows." "Lord, it ain't a case of murder, is it? I don't like that." "Remember that you told this young gentleman here and myself that you would know the swell again," said Skin of My Tooth sternly. "Yes, I could," replied the cabby, scratching his scraggy head. "But I don't like to get mixed up in police and things." "Must do something for your £5 note, eh?" "Well, sir, perhaps you're right." He was inclined to be loquacious, but Skin of My Tooth, having got what he wanted, was eager to be rid of him. I showed the amiable cabby out. I was longing to ask my chief 100 questions, and I found him sitting beside his desk, carefully examining the colored silk muffler. "There are stains on it, Muggins," he said quietly. "I am in an up today." "But I don't understand, sir. What is an advertisement about, and who is this swell who drove from Hamilton Terrace to Elgin and back?" "Why, Muggins, you're a bigger ass than I took you for. The swell, my boy, was Lord Ralph Hampton, and the murderer of Adam Norris. But I suspected at the moment that I saw the very elegant, very egotistical woman of the world, but I was afraid that it would be very difficult to prove. It was, no doubt, all settled between him and his wife. Lord Ralph arranged to have the interview between himself and Mrs. Norris should take place at the moment when it would be most convenient for my lord to tackle an unfortunate dramatic author. This ensured the wife being safely out of the way. I don't suppose for a moment that the murder was premeditated. Lord Ralph Morshampton probably lost his temper, and finding Adam Norris obdurate, knocked him down." "But what made you think of all this, sir?" "Only this, Muggins, that when people tell me a lie, I immediately look about me for the motive which made them tell that particular lie. Lady Ralph Morshampton, if you remember, told me that her husband is a very rich man, and that she had plenty of money at her command with which to gratify any passing whim. Now, that is not true. Lord Ralph Morshampton is a younger brother of the present Marquis de Chamberlain. His father, the late Marquis, left each of his sons an annuity of £3,000 a year, payable out of the estate. My inquiries into Lord Ralph Morshampton's financial position, as compared with the lie of his wife, gave me the first inkling, call it an intuition if you will, the possible state of the case, for clearly Lady Ralph was not indulged in the luxury of buying those letters for £4,000. However eager she was to possess them, her appointment with Mrs. Morris, therefore, was a feint, either in order to gain time or in order to devise some other means of gaining possession of those letters. After that, Muggins, taking it absolutely for granted that the murder was committed for the sake of those letters, it became easy enough to reduce the number of people interested in their possession to 3. There was Mrs. Norris, who wanted to sell them, Lady Ralph Morshampton, who wished to destroy them, and putting aside the question that the murder was really for too gruesome and horrible for any woman to refinement to have committed, it soon became an established fact that the 2 ladies were actually together at 196 Hamilton Terrace at the time that the murder was being perpetrated. You remember that the people in the flat below, and one accompanied by Mr. Norris, heard the noise and scuffle at 10:30. These were looming before me because the question of Lord Morshampton, the husband. I made inquiries among the servants at Hamilton Terrace and among the neighbors, and learned that he was passionately fond of his wife, and ever eager to hide her past history before his relatives and friends. He, too, then, would have a motive, far stronger than any, since it concerned of the woman he loved, to bury ever the scandal which might injure her position in society. Having got the motive, I soon sought the proof. I remembered that Lady Morshampton herself had said that her husband left the house at 10:15. I surmised that he would go to Sherlock Mansions to see Adam Norris, and since that he would not have had much time at his command, and would go there in a cab. I advertised in terms you know already, and got this morning very proof I sought for. You see, the whole matter became child's play once I had it clear. It was instinct, sir, I said, with genuine admiration. Marvelous intuition. Call it reflection, my boy, and you'll be about right. You see, the moment those letters were destroyed, the Morshampton's name slipped, as it were, right out of the case. My lady was right when she concluded that I could never have cited Mrs. Morris's behalf. She was quite ready to see the unfortunate woman go to the gallows, and to swear anything that would achieve that end. That is why I am inclined to think that she planned the whole thing, while her husband was on half willing. Now, Muggins, run along and take this muffler to Scotland Yard. Mrs. Norris comes up before the magistrate tomorrow. Poor woman, she has been a narrow shave, but what a fool she has been! Mrs. Norris was discharged by the magistrate. Everyone remembers, no doubt, the awful sensation caused by the suicide of Lord Ralph Morshampton in the house in Hamilton Terrace. There is always a special law for those in his possession. The whole matter of his guilt in the murder of Adam Norris was most effectually hushed up by the police, and the public never got to know the name of the swell who drove the Sherlock Mansions at 10:15 on that fatal night.